Here's something we haven't been able to say in a long time. The average price of a home in Canada fell last year. The Canadian Real Estate Association has reported its sales for December, and prices dropped a record 12%. CBC business reporter Jeannie Lee has the details.
Well, the year began red hot and ended up frozen solid. This graph shows us housing sales going back 5 years in Canada, and that includes spring of 2020 and the shock of the pandemic, the unprecedented rebound to new heights as Canadians prioritized shelter, plowed a lot of money into it at super low interest rates. And the market was still rallying hard into 2022, the year that we've shaded in gray. But in early March, the first of 7 interest rate hikes hit, and then the rising cost of everything was the second part of that double whammy, which launched 10 months in a row of falling sales and prices. Some of the wild numbers that came out of this latest report from the Canadian Real Estate Association is that in December, sales were down 39% from December of a year earlier, though that month really was close to a record high in terms of sales historically. The average national selling price dropped 12% year to year, a record drop in fact. The price by home type, another measure of how prices perform, down 13% from February, which, as it turns out, was the peak last year. The biggest sales drops came in Toronto and Vancouver. No surprise considering how expensive those markets are. Now, the biggest price drop came in Regina, with a drop of 20% in selling price, and in Toronto, where prices fell by 9%. Ottawa saw its price down just 1.3%, even as so many other markets were declining. Ottawa remained stable, true to its reputation of a very stable market for housing. And in Calgary, the price actually went up by 6.2% along with oil prices. So not all regional markets were melting down a lot or even at all. Now, CREA expects still lower sales and prices this year because prices are still well above where they were at the start of the pandemic, and interest rates have gone up so much so fast that a lot of mortgage payments have in fact doubled. And the Bank of Canada was also out with a new measure of sentiment. Consumers feel in large part that they are squeezed because their wages are not keeping up with inflation, and 72% of them expect a recession next year. Those are not great conditions for the housing market because you're buying the biggest purchase you'll ever make at interest rates that we haven't seen in a very long time.
CBC business reporter Jeannie Lee in Toronto. So prices down 12% from last December. How big of a drop is that overall? Well, Canada had been in a housing boom for years. As you can see by this chart, home prices rose steadily from 2005, rising more dramatically during the pandemic until the sudden drop at the end of 2022. For more on this, let's bring in Sour Somerville. He's a professor at the Sauder School of Business at the University of British Columbia and a senior fellow at UBC's Centre for Urban Economics and Real Estate. I appreciate you taking the time, Sour. So what do you make? What do you make of these latest numbers? Do they signal any kind of return to affordability?
So I don't think that they signal a return to affordability, because while the prices have come down a bit, and that helps you on the down payment side, at the same time, your mortgage payments have gone up, and in fact, your mortgage payments have gone up more, by enough that more than offsets that savings that you got on the down payment side. So it's, in order to get sort of true affordability, improvements in affordability, we would need to see more declines.
And do you think we will see more declines?
My expectation is, independent of what happens with the recession, that we would continue to see weakening in the market, just because there's such a large gap between the number of people looking for housing which is small compared to the number of units on the market. But the wild card is the recession.
And so tell me about that. You think that, are we heading towards a recession, and what could that mean for housing affordability?
Whatsoever. Your guess is as good as mine, right? Certainly, interest rates tend to squeeze the economy. And a lot of the thinking now is that the recessions that you get from interest rate hikes are driven by declines in the housing market, because not only do you see fewer purchases, but you see fewer starts as well. And that then percolates through the economy. Developers are having real trouble with financing and making those costs work, so you'd expect to see fewer starts. So it does seem reasonable to expect some degree of slowdown in the economy, which then creates uncertainty for people around jobs. You don't buy a house when your employment is uncertain, and you've got people, as your previous story indicated, very much squeezed by the increase in prices overall from inflation.
So what needs to happen? What do you think needs to happen to actually bring about, because you look at this 12% decline, you say, wow, well, that's something, but then you look at it over a period of time and it doesn't really feel like much, or you factor in that interest rates have gone up, so it just cancels out any kind of gain that people may make. What do you think needs to happen in order to create an environment where housing is more affordable?
The only thing that's really going to make a major impact on affordability in a long-term basis right now is dramatically increased supply in the tight markets. Because the other ways that you get at improved housing affordability are, dramatic economic downturns or crashes in the housing market, and those have, just tremendous negative consequences. So, ideally, what you'd like to see is house prices be kind of stable and frozen for a while as incomes catch up, and have substantial increases in supply. I think that first graph you showed, though, where you see that prices today, even when coming down, say 12% on average from their peaks, are still well above the trend line that we had until COVID hit. So you'd kind of like to see yourself at least get have another 10-15% decline in prices to get back to that trend line. That would be at least a place to start thinking about things.
So what do you say to people who are younger, who are trying to get into the market, who want to, but are just kind of unsure about what to do?
So the way I always take these things is sort of, how much do we expect good news versus how much do we expect bad news? And it certainly looks like there's more uncertainty and potential bad news than there is good news in terms of the economy and market conditions, which would be more suggestive of waiting if you can.
Suor, appreciate you taking the time. Thank you. Suor
Always a pleasure.
Is a senior fellow at UBC's Centre for Urban Economics and Real Estate in Vancouver.